Alright, ladies and gentlemen, now it's time to talk about arrays and Golang. So, an array, just in general, because it is something that is used in a lot of languages, an array is a number sequence of elements of a specific length. How I like to distinguish it, or how I like to think about it, is that it's a like you can think of boxes set up in a line, and each box represents data. How we retrieve that box is we just give a number to each box, and if we want to retrieve that value from the box, we use that number to get that specific box. So say for instance we have 10 boxes, right? And the special thing with arrays is that it starts at a zero index, so meaning that it starts from zero and it ends at 9. So if we have 10, it goes from 0 to 9 instead of going from 1 to 10. So if we wanted to retrieve the first item in an array, we would have to get 0. If we wanted to get the first box, we would have to use the 0 index. So let's write this out just to make it more simple for you to see. So let's create this Golang array. So what we got to do is first we got to distinguish that we want to create one. So let's just do var, and I was just talking about boxes, so let's do that. Let's create a variable called boxes, and we're just gonna let Golang know that this is gonna be an array, right? And this is gonna hold 10 items. So to do that, what we'll do is open up some brackets, and we're gonna let array know the length of the array. This length is gonna be the maximum amount of elements that can be stored, cannot go over it. So you should know from the jump or from the get-go that you want 10 items or whatever amounts once you create this array. So I know that I want to create 10 items for the amount of boxes. I cannot do 11 boxes, I can't do 12. It has to be 10 or less. All right. Then I'm going to specify the type of the items that's going to be in this array. We talked about types when we created variables in a previous tutorial. We know that we have strings, we know we have ints, we have floats, but in this case I'm only gonna use ints, so I'm just gonna do int, and just to make it more specific, I'm gonna say int of 32 bits. All right. So now we have a variable of an array, and this can hold 10 items, and it is of type int 32. Now the only red squiggly that is showing is that we have boxes, we have an array, but it's not being used. So pretty much we just created a variable, and we're letting Golang know that this variable can hold an array of 10 items that is of type int 32. So by default, an array in Golang is created as zeros if you don't provide a value. So we already specified that we want 10 items, right? We want an array of 10 items, but we didn't provide any value. So right now we have 10 boxes, and all those values will store the number 0 since we're using an int. So let's print that out so I can show you guys what this looks like. And let me just do go run dot, and boom, you see that we have 10 zeros, and they're lined up. And that's why I like to visualize it as boxes, because if we have some things laid out, we have boxes on the floor, each one of them have their own data. This is exactly how it looks like in my mind. So we have 10 zeros because we didn't provide any values to any of these boxes for it to store anything different. So by default, Golang makes it 0. Now to actually set one of these values, which mean to change the value of one of these items in an array, we could do that using the index. And I talked about index in the beginning, which is just the point of where a specific data is in the array. So I talked about how how the array starts at 0 and it goes up to the elements or the length -1. So we have 10 here, meaning that this array can only be of size 10. But to actually retrieve the last element in the array, we'll have to do 10 minus 1, because the array or the initial value in an array starts at position 0, not 1, but 0. So everything or the end has to be subtracted by 1. So to retrieve the first value, it would be index of 0. To retrieve the second value, it would be 1, and vice versa. Now to change the value, say for instance we wanted to change the first element, we would just have to get the name of the variable. We would have to open up some brackets, and then distinguish or place the index of the value that you want to change. Since we want to change the first value, all you have to use is 0, because 0 is the first index of the array. and we can set this to anything that is of int 32. So I just want to make it, let's make it 12. Now if I print this out, and before you see that everything was 0, but if I print this out, boom, I see that it is now showing that the first element is 12 because we retrieved the first element. This is how you retrieve it, and we're assigning it to the value of 12. And we can do that for every box up to the last element. So I did talk about how the last element is going to be the length of the array minus 1. So we can do that now. Let's do boxes 9 because 10 minus 1 is 9, and we can make that equal to, let's use 25. And if I run this again, you can see that 25 is at the end. Now, things could get nasty if you try to do anything that is outside the range of the array. This is why it's very important to know, where you are in the array. Because if I did try to do, boxes 10 because I made that mistake, first of all, Golang will say you're out of bounds, meaning you're out of the range of what you declared the array to be. Because yes, you did say you want boxes of size 10, but like I said, it starts at 0, so it's going to go from 0 to 9, not 1 to 10. So at least Golang knows beforehand, like, we're not going to let you run this because it's going to break, or we're showing you that it's going to break, it's going to be out of bounds. But say for instance you are running your application, and say for instance you have a loop, which we're going to talk about later in a tutorial series. But say for instance you're trying to get something outside the range of this array, it is going to panic, and we're also going to talk about that later in the series. But it is going to go, it's going to try to run it, and it's going to break the application. So let me see if I can actually run that and see what happens. So boom, invalid argument, index 10 is out of bounds, and it lets you know, like, where that's showing. It's showing line 8 has this issue. So just remember that, don't try to go over the bounds because it will break. And you can see that to access a value, a specific value, you just have to just open up the brackets and place the index of the value that you're trying to retrieve. So say for instance you just want to retrieve one value in this array. Let's just try to retrieve 9. You could just open up the brackets, put the index inside, and let me just clear this out, and let me just print it. Boom, you can see that just by using the index we can retrieve one value from the array. So in this case it's going to be 25 because we assigned the value of 25 to the index of the last element in the array. So arrays are pretty useful if you want like a structured sequence of elements grouped together. It's used a lot in programming, not just only in Golang, but programming in general. But there is a different type of sequence that is used more in Golang called slices, which we'll talk about next. But this is the first thing that I would say will help understand what a slice is. It's just it's a similar characteristic of an array where it's a sequence of characters, or it's a sequence of elements. So but this is just how you would use an array. This is how you would create one, this is how you will assign it, and this is how you will retrieve it. And arrays also do come with a function which we can get the actual length of an array. So to do that, we can run length, or let me just erase this and run len, which is just short for length. Open up parentheses and put the array inside of this function. So we'll put boxes because that's the array that we're trying to get the length of, and if we run this, and we should get 10. This just returns the length of the array. So we know by default this is going to be 10 because we set the array to be 10. So when we get the length, we just know that it's going to return 10. And this can be useful if you want to just get the last element, because if you want to get the last element, all you got to do is do boxes, and then you can do length, and then get the length of the array and do -1. This will guarantee that you will always get that last element of the array, and you don't have to worry about anything breaking because you can just use this logic to just get that last element. Just remember you have to do -1 because if you do just the length, it's going to break because you're going to go out of bounds. But if you do -1, it guarantees that you're going to get up to the last element in the array. And if I run this, you will see I see 25. So it guarantees the last element in the array. Before all we did was create a instance of an array and set the values one by one. But there is a way of initializing an array with values already in it if you don't want to just use the default values of 0. So let me show that really quick. So let's also just use the same variable. We'll just use boxes, and we're gonna let Golang interpret the array that we're about to create. I'm also going to use the same value of how much I want the length of the array to be, so I just make that 10, and I still want it to be an int 32, but now I'm going to open up some curly braces, and now we can start defining the values that we want to be initialized with the array, or with the array that we're creating, called boxes. So I want there to be, or actually let's make this shorter so that I can fill it up. I'd have to put 10 values. I could just put 5 just to make it simpler. So let's do 2, 3, 4, and 5. Right? The only thing that squiggly is showing is that I'm declaring it but not using it. So let's actually print this out. And let me clear this and run it. And now we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's what we shipped out with the array that we created. It is not the default values of 0 because we initialized it with values that we wanted. So if we wanted anything else, we could. We can make this 38 or 33, 22 if we wanted to. Run it again. These are the values that we shipped out with the array, and this is how you initialize it. Now you don't have to fill out all 5 values. Like if you want to partially initialize it, you can, and it will still understand it. So in this case, since we only filled out the first 2 values of a of an array of that's the size 5, it would just fill out the first 2. So if we print this again, it's just going to show 1 and 22, and the last 3 is going to be 0 because we didn't provide a value, so it's just going to provide the default values of that. Alright, so let's say you want to initialize a specific index in the array. We could also do that as well. Instead of like letting Golang interpret that we only want the first 2 values, say for instance we want to initialize only the first and the last value, we could do that. So all we got to do is first specify the index that we want to initialize. So in this case, we want to initialize the first value. So remember, arrays are 0 index, meaning that the first value will start at 0. So all we got to do is use the first index, which is 0, open up a colon, or use a colon, and then provide the value that we want to initialize. So in this case, I want the first value to be 1, so I use the index of 0, use a colon, and then provide the value, which is going to be 1. Then I want to initialize the last value. So we got to use the length minus 1. So in this case, we know the length is going to be 5, or that's the maximum length. And then we subtract that by 1, so it's going to be 4 for the last element. And open up or use a colon again, and then provide the value, which is going to be 22. So now we're saying we want an array, but the first value got to be 1, and the last value got to be 4. Let's save that and clear this out. We run that, and then boom. So the first value is 1, the last value is 22. So we can use arrays, or we can initialize arrays in different ways. It's pretty cool. This is pretty standard, but I think Golang added a little nice twist to it, because out of all the other languages that I've used in the past, like this hasn't really been something that could have been done. I know you can provide the index separately like we did before, like boxes, open up an index and then provide a value, but I never seen a way of doing this where you can provide the key of the index and then provide the value to initialize it. That's pretty cool by Golang, but I just want to show that that's an option, because that's not something that I've usually seen in other languages that I've seen that they added in Golang. So that is arrays in Golang. Another thing that I actually want to show before I end this off is multidimensional. And as you guys start to go into interviews, or if you want to do more of the math-based type of applications, I believe grids will be useful. So let's actually create a grid, because that's really what a multidimensional array is. It's essentially a grid. You can think of a box within a box, and we're going to see that really quick. So let's do that. So I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to erase this. I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to call it grid. And I want it to be a 3 by 3 multidimensional array. So how do we do that? What does that even mean? So just imagine, you know, we just talked about an array, which is, you know, up to a specific value. So just imagine we have, you know, boxes, but on top of boxes. So they're lined up, but there's also another line of boxes on top of it or below it, based on how you want to visualize it. But just think of boxes stacked on top of boxes instead of boxes in the same line or the same sequence. So you can think of, let's see, if you ever seen a Rubik's Cube, you could think of the front face of a Rubik's Cube, how they have, you know, the Rubik's Cubes, you know, rows stacked on top of each other. That's how we're going to create this multi-dimensional array. We're going to have a grid of 3 by 3, which is going to be, you know, 3 rows, but it's also going to be 3 columns. I think it's very important that you guys have a better understanding of visualizing this stuff, because by visualizing it, it'll be better to actually interpret it. So just like I said, think of a Rubik's Cube, think of it being 3 rows, right, but with 3 columns. So there's 3 boxes within that row, and there's 3 of them stacked on top of each other. So let's do this. And I think when I print it out, it'll be, you know, better to actually visualize. But I just wanted to get you guys to be able to interpret that when someone tells you to make a multi-dimensional array. So let's make a 3 by 3 grid, and it's going to be of type int. So this is the variable that's going to hold it. I call it grid, but, you know, it's declared but not used. So let's actually use it. And then we're going to make it equal to a 3 by 3 int, and we're actually going to initialize it this time. So we're going to make 3 of these, because we remember before we just placed the int inside of it, but because it's, you know, boxes or it's an array within an array, we have to declare an array within one array. So we're going to make 3 of these because we declared that we wanted 3. And if we leave out 1, that's fine as well. It's just going to create another row, but it's all going to be zeros. So actually, let me show that first. And within it, I want to, you know, create my own value. So I'm going to make the top row all 1s. And remember, it's going to be only of size 3. So that's what we're going to put 3 1s as. And I want the middle row to be 0, 1, and 0. Then the last row is going to be all zeros because I'm not going to specify it, so it's going to be the default values of 0. So let me print this out because I feel like printing it out will help you guys understand it more. So let's do grid, save that, and clear this out, and then we do go run. So if you can see, they're all in one row right now, but if you stack it on top of each other, it does look like the front face of a Rubik's Cube. It does look like a grid. And you see that the first row is all 1s, and then the second row is 0, 1, 0, and then, like I said, we didn't provide a value for the last row, so it's all zeros. And they're all 3 by 3. You know, we got 3 rows and we got 3 columns. And this first bracket specifies the rows, and this last bracket, specifies the column. So if we wanted to retrieve something with this grid, so say for instance we wanted to retrieve the first row, all we got to do is use the variable, open up a bracket, and then it's still 0 index. So if we want to grab the first row, which is this, we still have to use 0. It's not 1, it's 0, because that's going to be the first row. And let me print that out. So you can see that it's grabbing the first row. But say for instance we want to grab this middle 1. So we got to go to the first row, but we got to go to the middle column. Right? So because we know the length of the grid is 3 for the columns, all we got to get the middle row, all we got to do is, you know, get the minimum value of that, you know, of that column. So you know that's going to be 3 minus 1 to get the last element. If it's out of 2, then that means the middle element is going to be 1. So there's 0, 1, and 2. The middle is going to be 1. So that's how we get this middle value. So we're going to get the first row, and we're going to get the middle value, which in this case, the index of the middle value is 1. So let's open up another pair of brackets, and then use 1. I'm going to print that out. And boom, we grab 1. We want to grab the last elements. We know that the max value is 3. So 3 minus 1 is going to be 2. So run that again, it's still gonna be 1. Now if we want to grab the last row, all right, and get the first value in the last row, we just do 2 and grab the last column, we use 0. And then run that again. Let me clear that out. And run it again. It's going to be 0 because all the values on the last row is 0. So I would just recommend that you create your own grid. You mess around with the indexes. Make sure you know that you don't go out of the bounds of the indexes. And you just mess around with the rows and columns. I know that terminology kind of messed me up when I first started programming, rows and columns. But all you got to do is you can think of a chessboard. You can think of a Rubik's Cube, anything that has rows and columns, and just try to visualize it in a grid. And you can even go by the rows and columns of whatever you're using. So say for instance you're using a chessboard. If a chessboard has 10 rows, just make a grid of 10 rows. And I'm not sure how many columns a chessboard has as well, but you can also use 8s or whatever, and just mess around with that. And you would also have to use 10 and 8 here when actually initializing it. And then you can mess around with the values here, and try to retrieve them from the grid. So it's just really playing around with it and finding use cases, because I know there's many use cases, especially when it comes to coding interviews for these multi-dimensional arrays. So I would say play around with it and try to get a better understanding. So that is a multi-dimensional array in Golang, and that's also arrays in Golang. If you have any questions, just let me know.